Hey guys, tonight we are trading our soft pillows for the unforgiving weight of a steel breastplate and the pungent aroma of a stable that hasn't been mucked out in 3 weeks. We're heading back to a time where the status symbol wasn't a blue checkmark on social media, but how many layers of polished iron you could strap to your body before your horse's spine gave up. You'll be navigating the treacherous courts of Byzantium and the dusty, blood-soaked plains of the Crusades. I should probably warn you, you probably won't survive this journey, mostly because basic hygiene hasn't been invented yet, and a small scratch from a rusty dagger is basically a death sentence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far these stories travel while you're trying to catch some sleep. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for the soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of a muddy field in the year 1415. The air is thick with the smell of wet wool, iron rust, and the nervous sweat of several thousand men who would much rather be at home eating turnip soup. You reach down to the heavy leather belt slung across your hips and feel the cold, reassuring pommel of your longsword. In the movies, this is your primary tool. You'd think this blade is a magical wand capable of slicing through an anvil like it's room temperature butter. But here's the reality check. Your sword is essentially the medieval version of a backup battery or a sidearm. It's what you pull out when your real weapon, the one that actually does the heavy lifting, has snapped in half or been buried in some unlucky foot soldier's chest. You trudge through the sludge, the weight of your gear shifting with every step. The sword at your side clangs rhythmically against your thigh, a constant reminder of its presence. To the modern eye, the sword is the icon of the knight, but to you, it's a tool of last resort. Think of it like a smartphone today. Everyone sees you with it, it costs a small fortune, and it looks great in photos. But if you're trying to build a house, you'd much rather have a power drill. In the medieval world, that power drill was a pole axe or a lance. The sword was just the expensive accessory you hoped you wouldn't have to rely on. As you look down at the hilt, you notice the intricate wire wrap around the grip. This isn't just for aesthetics, it's there because once the fighting starts, your hands are going to get slippery with sweat, rain, or things we won't mention for the sake of your appetite. One mainstream historical fact that often gets buried under Hollywood's pile of gleaming steel is that swords were almost entirely useless against the plate armor you're currently wearing. If you swung your sword at another knight's chest, you wouldn't cut him in half. You just make a very loud, very annoying clack sound, and perhaps leave a minor scratch on his expensive custom-fitted steel. It's like trying to cut a car door with a kitchen knife. You aren't getting through, and now the car is just mad at you. Historians still argue whether the extreme specialization of swords, like the stiff, needle-pointed estoc, was a direct response to the perfection of plate armor or if it was a tactical dead end that people just happened to be obsessed with for a few decades. Regardless of the scholarly bickering, you know that if you want to actually hurt the guy in the tin can across from you, you need to stop thinking about cutting and start thinking about physics. You pull the blade an inch out of its scabbard. The steel is cold, smelling faintly of the animal fat you used this morning to keep the rust away. A quirky fringe tidbit you might find interesting while you're trying to drift off is that some knights actually believed their swords had a soul. They'd name them things like Joyous or the Tooth of the Dragon, though in reality, the most soulful thing about a sword was a tiny relic. Maybe a bit of a saint's bone or a scrap of holy cloth, sometimes tucked into the hollow pommel. It was essentially the medieval version of a lucky rabbit's foot, but with more theological paperwork. If the sword didn't work, you could at least hope for a bit of divine intervention before you got pummeled into the dirt. The balance of the weapon is what surprises you the most. People today think medieval swords were heavy, clumsy bars of iron weighing 20 pounds. In truth, your long sword weighs barely 3 pounds. It's agile, responsive, and balanced so perfectly that the weight sits right near your hand. It's less like a club and more like a very long, very sharp finger. But again, sharpness is a relative term. You don't keep the edge razor sharp like a modern chef's knife. If it were that thin, the first time you hit a steel buckler or a helmet, the edge would chips away like a cheap porcelain plate. The edge is robust, designed to survive the high velocity impact of steel on steel. You look around the camp, you see your fellow knights polishing their blades with a mixture of vinegar and sand, a process that sounds like 1,000 angry crickets. This is the glamour of the knightly life. Endless maintenance. Your gear is a full-time job. If you don't scrub that blade, by next Tuesday it'll be orange with rust, and you'll be the laughingstock of the local tournament. It's like owning a high-maintenance sports car that also happens to be your only insurance policy against being stabbed. The sword was also a massive financial investment. Buying a high-quality sword in the 14th century was roughly equivalent to buying a brand new mid-sized SUV today. It wasn't something a common peasant could just pick up at the local market. When you see a knight carrying a sword, you aren't just seeing a warrior, you're seeing a walking bank account. It was a sign that you belonged to the elite, the 1% who were legally allowed and financially able to carry the noble weapon. You feel the wind pick up, whistling through the narrow eye slits of your helmet. It's a claustrophobic world in there. Your vision is reduced to a horizontal strip, making everything feel like a widescreen movie with a very low budget. You can hear your own breathing, echoing inside the metal chamber of your bassinet, smelling the recycled air and the faint scent of the padded linen cap underneath. Everything is sensory overload, the weight, the smell, the sound. You realize that the sword, for all its fame, is just a small part of a very complex, very heavy, and very sweaty ecosystem of war. As you prepare to move forward, you realize that the myths are starting to fade. The shining knight isn't a hero in a clean cape. You're a tired, damp man in a heavy metal suit holding a backup tool that you hope you won't have to use, because if you're down to your sword, it means things have gone horribly wrong. You take a deep breath, the cold air filtering through the ventilation holes of your visor, and prepare for the reality of what happens when the lances break and the real work begins. As you stand there, your hand instinctively tightens around the middle of your sword's blade. Yes, you heard that right. You are grabbing the sharp part. In the movies, if a hero touches the edge of a sword, their fingers fall off like overcooked sausages. But here in the reality of the 15th century, your leather gauntlets are thick, sturdy, and reinforced with metal scales. You're practicing what the masters call half-swording. Think of it as the medieval version of shifting your grip on a pool cue to get a more precise shot. You aren't trying to hack through your opponent's steel chest plate anymore. You've realized that's as productive as trying to punch a hole through a skyscraper with a baguette. Instead, you've turned your sword into a short, incredibly stiff spear. You feel the cold grain of the steel against your gloved palm. It's a strange sensation, holding the very thing that is supposed to be doing the cutting. But by gripping the blade, you gain immense leverage and accuracy. You're no longer a guy swinging a stick, you're a surgeon with a very large, very heavy scalpel. Your eyes, squinting through the narrow visor of your helmet, are searching for the software bugs in your enemy's hardware. You're looking for the gaps. Even the most expensive suit of plate armor has weak points. The armpits, the groin, the back of the knees, and most importantly, the narrow slits of the visor. One mainstream historical fact that might keep you awake or help you drift off is that nearly all armored combat eventually devolved into this kind of high-stakes precision probing. You aren't looking for a killing blow to the chest, you're looking for a 4-inch opening where the steel plates meet. Imagine trying to thread a needle while someone is actively trying to hit you over the head with a toaster. That's essentially what you're doing. You move with a heavy, clanking grace, your boot sinking into the churned up earth. Every movement is a calculated expenditure of energy. You can't afford to be flashy. Flashy gets you tired, and in the medieval world, being tired is a first step toward becoming a permanent part of the local geography. You watch your opponent, another man encased in a similar tin can of polished iron. He looks less like a person and more like a very angry bipedal wood stove. Historians still argue whether these highly technical maneuvers from the fencing manuals, like the half sword or the murder stroke, were actually used in the chaotic, muddy soup of a full-scale battlefield like Agincourt, or if they were mostly reserved for the controlled environment of a judicial duel. It's a bit like wondering if someone in a bar fight actually uses professional MMA techniques or if they just resort to swinging wildly until someone falls over. But you, in this moment, feel the necessity of it. If you don't find a gap, you're just two guys in expensive suits having a very loud, metallic, hugging match. Speaking of murder strokes, you decide to try something truly desperate. You flip the sword around. Now, you're holding the blade with both hands, aiming the heavy crossguard and the solid steel pommel at your opponent's head. This is the Mordschlag. You have effectively turned your high-end, luxury sword into a very expensive, very top-heavy hammer. It's like using your Fador's $200 smartphone as a brick because the touchscreen stopped working and you really need to break a window. A quirky fringe tidbit for your sleepy brain to chew on. The crossguards on some of these swords were actually sharpened into points specifically for this purpose, turning the noble sword into a makeshift pickaxe. If you can land that pommel on the side of his helmet, the shock alone might be enough to scramble his brains like a Sunday morning omelet. The sound of the battlefield is a muffled roar inside your helmet. It's a mix of clanging metal, horses screaming in a language only they understand, and the rhythmic thump-thump of your own heart. It's incredibly hot. You're essentially wearing a wearable sauna that also happens to be a lightning rod for blunt force trauma. The sweat is stinging your eyes, but you can't wipe them. You have to wait for it to drip down your nose. A slow, tickling torture that you just have to accept. This is the glamour of the knightly class, being slowly braised in your own juices while someone tries to hit you with a hilt. You notice a small opening near your opponent's gorget, the steel plate protecting his neck. You lung forward, using your body weight to drive the point of your sword into that tiny sliver of space. It's not like the movies where the sword slides in like it's entering a tub of butter. There's jarring resistance, the sound of steel rasping against steel like a fork scraping a dinner plate in a way that makes your teeth ache. You're wrestling now. Real knightly combat looks less like a choreographed dance and more like a very violent, very heavy game of Twister played in the mud. You remember that a sword is only as good as the person holding it, and right now you're feeling every bit of the 45 pounds of steel strapped to your frame. It's a weirdly intimate way to fight. You are close enough to smell the other guy's desperation, a mix of old ale, onions, and the iron scent of the armor itself. You're so close you can see the scratches on his visor from previous encounters. These aren't just weapons. They are the tools of a very specific, very dangerous trade. As the sun begins to dip lower, casting long orange shadows across the field, you realize that the sword is just a lever, a pry bar, and a hammer all rolled into one. It's a Swiss Army knife of the apocalypse. You step back, your chest heaving. the air inside your helmet feeling like it's been recycled through a vacuum cleaner bag. You've survived this encounter, but you know that the sword was just the beginning. There are other things out there in the mud, things designed not to find gaps, but to simply ignore the armor altogether. You look at the fallen mace a few feet away, its heavy, flanged head caked in dirt, and you realize that sometimes being a surgeon isn't enough. Sometimes you just need a bigger hammer. The reality of the gap targeting and the half swording lifestyle is that it requires nerves of steel and fingers that don't mind a bit of friction. It's a world of precision in a landscape of chaos. You take a moment to adjust your grip, the leather of your gauntlets creaking in the silence of your own head, and prepare for the next clattering symphony of iron. You let the sword slide back into its scabbard with a metallic hiss that feels like a sigh of relief. It's a beautiful tool, really, but you've realized that trying to cut through a man in full plate armor with a blade is about as effective as trying to open a can of sardines with a silk scarf. You need something with a bit more gravitas. You reach for the weapon hanging from a secondary loop on your saddle, the mace. If the sword is a high-end fountain pen, the mace is a heavy-duty sledgehammer with a bad attitude. It's essentially a thick iron rod topped with a heavy, flanged head. A smart brick designed for the sole purpose of turning that expensive, custom-fitted Italian steel your opponent is wearing into a very uncomfortable, very dented coffin. As you lift it, you feel the weight concentrated entirely at the end. It's top-heavy, awkward, and brutal. There is no fencing with a mace. You don't parry in the way they do in those fancy French manuals. You simply swing it with the focused energy of a frustrated homeowner trying to fix a leaky pipe with a mallet. When you hit someone with this, you aren't trying to find a gap in their armor. You're trying to ignore the armor entirely. One mainstream historical fact you might find amusing is that the mace became the go-to weapon for many high-ranking church officials on the battlefield, like Bishop Odo of Bayeux. The logic, and I use that term very loosely, was that as men of the cloth, they weren't supposed to shed blood, and a sword or a spear would definitely do that. But a mace? Well, technically, you're just applying extreme blunt force trauma. If his head happens to turn into a cracked walnut inside his helmet without a drop of blood hitting the grass. That's just a legal technicality between the bishop and the almighty. It's an ultimate medieval loophole. The sensory experience of using a mace is entirely different from the sword. There is no singing of the blade. Instead, there's a thud that you feel all the way up your arm, vibrating into your shoulder and teeth. It's a bone-shaking impact. Imagine being inside a massive church bell while someone hits the outside with a wrecking ball. That is what your opponent experiences when your mace connects with his helmet. Even if the steel doesn't break, the shockwave passes right through it, rattling the brain like a marble in a tin can. It's the medieval version of a system reboot, except the operating system usually doesn't come back online. You trudge forward, the mace feeling like a natural extension of your irritation. The air is still thick with the smell of the damp earth and the metallic tang of the armor, but now there's the added scent of splintered wood and crushed leather. A quirky fringe tidbit you might enjoy while you're settling into your blankets is that some maces were so intricately decorated, covered in gold leaf and carved with religious icons, that they were basically pieces of high-end jewelry that just happened to be capable of crushing a human ribcage. It's like carrying a Fabergé egg that's been welded to a lead pipe. It was a way of saying, I am incredibly wealthy, deeply pious, and I'm going to dent your face into the next century. Historians still argue whether the mace was a reaction to the perfection of plate armor or if it was simply a more cost-effective way to equip a secondary cavalry force. After all, a mace is much easier to manufacture than a balanced steel sword. It doesn't require the same level of master smithing. You just need a lot of iron and a very sturdy handle. It's the budget-friendly option for the apocalypse. Yet it was often more effective than the luxury alternative. You swing it at a training post as you move, the flanged head biting deep into the oak. Those flanges, the little fins on the head of the mace, are a stroke of genius. They focus all that swinging energy into a tiny, concentrated point of impact, ensuring that the force isn't distributed across the armor but driven right through it. It's like the difference between someone stepping on your foot in a sneaker versus a stiletto heel. The dark humor of the battlefield isn't lost on you. You realize that while you're wearing the finest protection 14th century technology can buy, you're basically just a very expensive piece of fruit inside a very sturdy skin. And the guy across from you is holding a juice press. You think about the medieval healthcare system. If you survive a mace hit, the doctor, who is usually just a barber with a very sharp hobby, might suggest a good bloodletting or perhaps some boiled cabbage to fix your imbalanced humors. Medicine in this era is really just polite torture with a theology degree. You'd honestly rather take your chances with the mace than the surgeon's rusted pliers. You look at your gauntlet, the leather creaking as you tighten your grip on the mace's handle. You can feel the sweat dripping down the back of your neck, soaking into the padded gambeson beneath your plate. It's itchy, it's hot, and it smells like a gym bag that's been left in a trunk for a decade. But the mace gives you a strange sense of confidence. You don't need to be a master of the long point or the ox guard. You just need to be strong and lucky. It's a weapon for the pragmatist. You pass a group of soldiers practicing with the warhammer, the mace's even angrier cousin. One side of the head is a blunt hammer for denting, and the other is a sharp, curved bec de corbin, or crow's beak, designed to peel armor like an orange. You watch them work and realize that warfare has become a competition of high-velocity hardware. It's no longer about the grace of the duel, it's about who can apply the most kilopascals of pressure to a single square inch of steel. The sun is catching the polished edges of your mace's flanges, sending little glints of light dancing across the mud. It looks almost peaceful in a terrifying sort of way. You take a slow breath, feeling the weight of the weapon pull at your wrist. You know that soon the clanging symphony will start again, and you'll be out there, swinging your iron club, trying to turn a knight in shining armor into a knight in slightly less shining, very dented armor. You realize that the mace is the ultimate equalizer. It doesn't care about your lineage or your fancy sword-fighting school. It only cares about gravity and the sudden stop at the end of a swing. You settle into a steady pace, the rhythmic clink-thud of your gear acting as a heavy, metallic lullaby as you move toward the front lines. You aren't on your feet anymore, and frankly, your knees are thanking you for the promotion. You are now perched atop a destrier, a massive, muscular engine of bone and fur that represents the absolute pinnacle of medieval military hardware. If your armor is your personal protective equipment, this horse is your biological tank. From up here, the world looks smaller, and the men on foot look less like threats and more like very slow-moving speed bumps. You reach out and take hold of your primary weapon, the lance. This isn't just a long stick, it's 12 feet of solid ash wood, tapered toward the point and balanced so that it feels surprisingly light until you start moving. As you settle into the high-backed saddle, you feel the lance rest, or arete, on the right side of your breastplate. This is a small steel bracket that looks like a glorified coat hook, but it is the secret sauce of the knightly charge. You couch the lance under your arm, tucking the butt of the weapon into that bracket. This turns your entire body and by extension, the 1,000 pounds of charging horse meat beneath you into a single focused point of impact. You aren't just poking someone with a stick, you are delivering the kinetic energy of a small sedan going 30 miles an hour through a piece of steel the size of a dinner plate. It's a controlled car crash where you're the one holding the steering wheel and the airbag hasn't been invented yet. The air smells different up here. It's less about the mud and more about the warm, earthy scent of the horse, the pungent aroma of leather grease, and the faint, sweet smell of hay that hasn't quite been digested yet. One mainstream historical fact you should keep in mind as you sway in the saddle is that lances were almost always one-use items. Hollywood loves to show knights carrying the same lance through an entire movie, but in reality, they were designed to shatter. If the lance didn't break on impact, the force of the collision would likely snap your arm like a dry twig or catapult you backward, off your horse like a human lawn dart. Breaking the lance was actually the goal. It meant all that energy was successfully dumped into your target instead of into your own shoulder. You adjust your grip, feeling the rough texture of the wood through your gloves. A quirky fringe tidbit that might help you drift off into a dream of the tournament circuit is the existence of the vamp plate. This was a large, funnel-shaped shield made of steel that sat on the lance just in front of your hand. It was basically a giant metal handguard, designed to stop your opponent's lance from sliding down your own weapon and turning your fingers into a collection of very expensive, very crushed souvenirs. It made the lance look like a terrifying, oversized umbrella handle, but it was the only thing standing between you and a very long recovery in a monastery infirmary. Historians still argue whether the famous heavy cavalry charge was actually performed at a full, headlong gallop or if it was more of a disciplined, rhythmic trot. While a gallop looks better for the highlights reel, a trot allowed the knights to stay in a tight knee-to-knee formation, what they called a conroy. Imagine a wall of steel moving towards you with absolutely no gaps. It wasn't about speed so much as it was about the psychological terror of an unstoppable, vibrating mass of iron. It's like being at the bottom of a hill when a fleet of garbage trucks starts rolling toward you without their brakes. Speed is less important than the sheer crushing weight. You look down at your horse's ears, which are twitching nervously as the trumpets sound. These horses weren't just transport. They were trained to be as mean as a landlord on rent day. A war horse was taught to bite, kick, and strike out with its forehooves. If you found yourself surrounded by foot soldiers, your horse would effectively become a secondary weapon. System: doing the grappling while you reach for that mace or sword we talked about earlier. Being a knight is a team sport, and your teammate weighs half a ton and has teeth the size of piano keys. The tension in the air is thick enough to cut with, well, with a sword, I suppose. You feel the vibration of the other horses around you, a low-frequency hum that resonates in your chest. It's a rhythmic, hypnotic sound, the clop-clink of thousands of hooves and chainmail links hitting each other. It's almost peaceful in a waiting for the world to end sort of way. You think about the cost of everything you're currently using. The horse alone probably costs more than a small village's entire annual output. You are literally riding a pile of money into a situation where people are going to try very hard to break it. You start to move forward, the trot shifting the weight of the lance in your grip. You have to keep it pointed up at the sky for now, the active position until the very last moment. Lowering it too early would tire your arm out, and your arm is already feeling the strain of the armor. Remember that backup battery sword. It's still there, bumping against your leg, a silent promise that if this wood snaps, you still have a way to fight. But for now, the lance is king. You realize that this is the medieval version of high-speed broadband. You're delivering data in the form of blunt force trauma at the highest possible speed the 14th century can manage. You take a slow, deep breath. The visor of your helmet muffling the sound of the wind. The world narrows down to the space between your horse's ears and the shield of the man across from you. It's a moment of strange, quiet focus before the car crash begins. You lean forward slightly, feeling the power of the beast beneath you, and prepare for the moment when the wood meets the iron and the air fills with the sound of 1,000 splintering trees. As you drift closer to the point of impact, you find yourself surprisingly calm. The rhythmic motion of the horse is like a giant hairy cradle. The weight of the lance becomes a part of you, an extension of your intent. You aren't just a man, you are a projectile. And as the world speeds up, the sounds of the battlefield begin to fade into a singular, white noise roar, leaving you with nothing but the target and the cold, hard wood of the lance. The lance has splintered into 1,000 jagged needles, and you've been hauled off your horse. Now, you're back in the mud, and the high-flying car crash of the cavalry charge has been replaced by something much more visceral, and frankly, a lot less dignified. You aren't fencing anymore. You are grappling. Imagine trying to wrestle a refrigerator in a bathtub filled with lukewarm chocolate pudding. That is what it feels like to engage in an armored wrestling match on a rainy Tuesday in the Middle Ages. Your opponent is just as tired as you are, his breathing coming in ragged, metallic rasps that sound like a dying bellows. You've dropped your mace and your sword is trapped against your hip by the sheer proximity of your enemy. You reach out, grab him by the neck guard of his helmet, and pull. This is the reality of knightly combat that the movies usually skip over in favor of sparks and spinning sword moves. Real battles often ended with two very expensive, very angry men rolling around in the dirt, trying to find a way to stop the other person from moving. One mainstream historical fact you should know is that Harnischfechten, or armored combat, was more about judo than it was about slashing. You use your opponent's weight against him. If you can trip him, his 45 pounds of steel will do most of the work for you, pinning him to the ground like a beetle on its back. Once he's down, the honorable knightly duel becomes a very practical exercise in anatomy and physics. You feel the grit of the sand and blood between your fingers as you reach for the one weapon that truly matters in this horizontal nightmare, the misericord. This is a long, thin, needle-like dagger, often triangular or square in cross-section. Its name literally means mercy, which is the ultimate medieval sarcasm, because it was used to provide the mercy of a quick death, or at least a very final one. It has no edge for cutting. It is a pure stabbing instrument, designed to slide through the narrowest gaps in a suit of plate armor. It's the reset button for a knightly career. As you pin your opponent's shoulder into the mud with your knee, you look for the entrance. The merciful dagger is perfect for the armpit, where the steel plates have to be thinner and more articulated to allow for movement. Or, if you're feeling particularly grim, you aim for the eye slits of the visor, a quirky fringe tidbit for your sleepy mind. Some knights carried a specific type of dagger called a rondelle, named for the round, plate-like guards at the hilt and pommel. These weren't just for show. The round guards allowed you to put the palm of your hand on the back of the dagger and use your entire body weight to drive the point through heavy leather or even chainmail. It was essentially a manual, hand-powered drill for human beings. Historians still argue whether the high number of captured knights in certain battles was due to the chivalric code of ransom or simply because it was physically exhausting to actually kill someone in full plate armor. It's much easier to sit on a guy and wait for his squire to bring a bag of gold than it is to spend 20 minutes trying to find a gap in his steel shell with a tiny knife while you're both hyperventilating. From your perspective, lying here in the muck, ransom sounds like a much better business model than murder. It's the medieval version of capture the flag, but the flag is a person who can pay your mortgage for the next decade. The sensory details of this mud wrestling are overwhelming. You can hear the squelch of the earth under your backplates, a sound like a wet boot pulling out of a swamp. The smell is a toxic cocktail of iron, wet wool, and the unmistakable, sharp scent of adrenaline. You can see the individual rivets on your opponent's helmet, each one a tiny mountain of steel that you've become intimately acquainted with. Your vision is still restricted to that narrow letterbox view, making the world feel small, dark, and incredibly dangerous. You realize that your armor is both your best friend and your personal prison. It keeps you alive, but it also makes you slow, heavy, and prone to drowning in 6 inches of water if you fall face down. You think about the chivalry you were promised in the songs. The troubadours never mention the part where you have to use your elbow to grind a man's face into the gravel so he'll stop trying to stick a rondelle into your femoral artery. Chivalry is a very thin veneer over a very brutal reality. It's like a fancy restaurant that has a Michelin star, but a kitchen that hasn't been cleaned since the Crusades began. You do what you have to do to survive, and you worry about the honor part once you're back in your tent drinking watered down wine. The weight of your gear is starting to feel like a physical burden on your soul. Every time you lift your arm, it feels like you're lifting a bucket of lead. You realize that endurance is the most important weapon you have. The man who gets tired first is the man who gets the mercy dagger. You focus on your breathing, slow, deep inhales of the dusty, metallic air inside your helmet. You try to keep your heart rate down, even though every instinct is screaming at you to panic. It's a meditative state of violence. The sun is beginning to catch the edge of your dagger, a cold, silver glint in the gathering gloom. You have your opponent pinned, his movements becoming sluggish and weak. You hold the misericord above his visor, and for a second, everything goes quiet. The roar of the battle fades into the background, leaving just the two of you in this small, muddy corner of history. You decide not to use it, not out of mercy, but because you recognize the crest on his surcoat. He's worth at least 300 gold crowns, and you really need to fix the roof on your manor house. You pull him up, the mud sticking to both of you like a heavy, brown second skin. You are both breathing like you've just run a marathon while wearing a cast iron stove. This is the end of the glamorous duel. Two tired men, covered in filth, agreeing to a financial transaction so they can both go home and complain about their backs. You lead him away, the rhythmic clank squish of your boots in the mud acting as a final, weary lullaby for the day's work. You realize that being a knight isn't about the sword or the horse. It's about the grit, the grappling, and the sheer stubborn refusal to stay down in the dirt. You are no longer in the mud, but the mud is certainly still in you, or at least in every crevice of the intricate machine you've been living in for the last 12 hours. Now that the adrenaline has ebbed away, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache in muscles you didn't even know you possessed, you begin the arduous process of unboxing yourself. This is the part of the nightly life that doesn't make it into the tapestries, the reality of living inside an iron sauna. You stand in your drafty tent, arms held out like a tired scarecrow, while your squire fumbles with the leather straps and iron buckles. As the breastplate is finally lifted away, you feel a sudden, jarring lightness, as if you might actually float off the ground and through the canvas roof. Living in plate armor isn't just about protection, It's a sensory experience that redefines the word uncomfortable. Imagine wearing a custom-fitted 30-pound tuxedo made of cold, unyielding kitchen appliances and then trying to run a Spartan race in a steam room. That is your life. One mainstream historical fact that people often get wrong is the weight. Your suit weighs about 45 to 55 pounds. While that sounds heavy, it's actually lighter than the equipment a modern firefighter or a specialized infantry soldier carries today. The difference is the distribution. The weight is spread across your entire body, held in place by a complex system of internal belts and points. You can run, jump, and, historians have proven, even perform a somersault in full plate. But just because you can do a backflip doesn't mean you want to do it while your sweat is pooling in your boots like a miniature personal ocean. The smell is the first thing that hits you as the layers come off. It's a pungent, fermented bouquet of wet linen, old metal, and the sharp, vinegary tang of human exertion. Beneath the steel, you aren't wearing silk. You're wearing a gambeson, a thick quilted tunic stuffed with scrap wool or linen. It acts as a shock absorber, preventing the steel from bruising your ribs every time you take a breath or a blow. By the end of a day's march, this garment is less like clothing and more like a heavy, soggy sponge. A quirky fringe tidbit you might find interesting is that knights would sometimes use aromatic herbs like dried lavender or crushed mint stuffed into their padding to mask the scent of their own knightly musk. It was a desperate, floral attempt to ignore the fact that they hadn't had a proper bath since the last lunar eclipse. Historians still argue whether the transition to full-plate armor was driven primarily by the rising power of the English longbow or the increasing prevalence of early gunpowder weapons. Some believe it was an arms race of piercing versus plating, while others suggest it was more about the social prestige of looking like a gleaming, untouchable statue. For you, the debate is academic. You just know that when the arrows start falling like black rain, you're glad to be inside your iron fortress, even if it means you have the permanent itch on your shoulder blade that you haven't been able to scratch for 6 hours. The physical toll of the iron sauna is visible in the mirror. If you had one that wasn't just a polished piece of bronze. Your skin is pale, pruned from the humidity and covered in armor bite. These are the red welts and chafing marks where the steel plates have rubbed against your joints. Your shoulders are bruised from the weight of the pauldrons, and your shins are raw from the constant friction of the greaves. It's a specialized kind of torture that you pay a fortune to endure. You think about the glamour of the knightly image, the way the sun glints off the polished curves of the steel, and you realize it's all just high-end marketing. Inside the suit, you're just a man who really wants to stand in a cold breeze and eat a piece of fruit. The sounds of the armor are your constant companion. Every movement produces a rhythmic clink-clack-creak. It's a mechanical symphony. You learn to interpret these sounds. A certain squeak means a strap is loosening. A sharp ping means a rivet has finally given up the ghost. It's like driving a vintage car where you have to listen to the engine to know if you're about to break down on the highway. You become hyper aware of your own geometry. You have to remember that you are now 6 inches wider and 2 inches taller than you are in your civilian clothes. You've probably knocked over more than one table in a tavern just by forgetting that you have steel hips now. The heat is a true enemy. On a summer day, the sun turns your breastplate into a frying pan. There are accounts of knights literally collapsing from heat stroke without a single wound on their bodies. You have to find ways to cope. You stay in the shade, you drink watered down wine that tastes more like the barrel than the grape, and you pray for a cloud. You realize that the Dark Ages were actually quite bright and far too hot for anyone wearing an oven. You feel a strange kinship with the blacksmith who made this gear. They spent weeks hammering this steel into shape, and now you're spending your life trying to survive inside their masterpiece. As the last of the leg armor, the cuisses and Poland are removed, you sit on a wooden stool and let out a long, shuddering breath. The air in the tent feels incredibly cold on your damp skin, a sensation that is better than any victory on the battlefield. You look at the pile of steel on the floor. It looks like a shed skin, a metallic ghost of the man you were an hour ago. It's beautiful in a terrifying, industrial sort of way. You know that tomorrow morning you'll have to put it all back on again, strap by strap, buckle by buckle, and step back into the sauna. But for now, the world is quiet. The heavy clanging of the day is over, replaced by the soft crackle of a campfire outside and the distant, low murmur of the camp. You reach for a cup of water, your hands shaking slightly from the residual fatigue. You realize that being a knight isn't just about the moment of combat. It's about the sheer endurance of existing in a world of metal. You lay back on your straw mattress, the absence of the armor feeling like a heavy blanket of its own, and let the rhythmic sounds of the night wash over you. You are a man again, no longer a machine, and that is enough to let you finally close your eyes. The heavy clatter of European iron fades into the distance, replaced by the rhythmic, hypnotic chant of a bustling marketplace in 6th century Constantinople. You aren't a man in a metal suit anymore. You are a witness to one of history's most improbable zero-to-hero stories. You're standing in the dust of the hippodrome, the air smelling of roasted meats, expensive incense, and the distinct, musky scent of the bear pits. Here, amidst the chaos of the Byzantine Empire, you find a young girl named Theodora. She isn't wearing a crown, not yet. Right now, she's wearing the tattered costume of a mime, following her mother into the center of the arena to beg for a job. Her father was the master of the bears for the green faction, but he's dead, leaving the family with nothing but the dirt under their fingernails and a very uncertain future. You watch her grow up in the shadow of the circus, a world where the line between performer and social pariah is as thin as a silk veil. In Byzantium, actresses are at the very bottom of the social ladder, legally classified alongside prostitutes. To the polite society of the era, you are less a person and more a public utility for entertainment. But Theodora doesn't just survive, she thrives. She's sharp, funny, and has a way of commanding a room that makes even the most cynical senators forget their dignity. Think of her as the medieval version of a child star who somehow manages to outsmart the entire industry while everyone else is waiting for her to fail. One mainstream historical fact that modern textbooks often highlight is that her scandalous past was documented in grueling, perhaps exaggerated detail by the historian Procopius in his Secret History. He described her performances as, well, let's just say they weren't exactly PG-13. As you follow her journey, you see her leave the stage behind, traveling to North Africa and back, eventually settling in a small house near the palace where she spends her days spinning wool. It's a complete image rebrand, the 6th century version of deleting your old social media posts and starting fresh with a wholesome aesthetic. And it works. It works so well that she catches the eye of Justinian, the nephew of the emperor and the man who would soon rule the world. Justinian is a workaholic, a man who sleeps little and dreams of rebuilding the Roman Empire. But when he meets Theodora, the software of his brain seems to hit a glitch. He doesn't just want her as a mistress, he wants her as his wife. The problem? It's literally illegal. A law from the time of Augustus forbade senators and high-ranking officials from marrying actresses. It was the ultimate social firewall. But Justinian isn't a man who takes no for an answer. He convinces his uncle, the Emperor Justin, to change the law, a move that causes the aristocratic elite of Constantinople to collectively lose their minds. A quirky fringe tidbit you might find fascinating as you settle into your pillow is that Justinian didn't just tweak the law, he basically rewrote the entire concept of social mobility in Byzantium just so he could marry the girl from the bear pits. It was the most expensive I do in history, costing the empire a significant amount of political capital. Historians still argue whether Theodora's later religious fervor and her fierce protection of the Miaphysite sect were genuine expressions of her faith or a calculated political move to ensure she had a power base independent of her husband. Was she a devout convert seeking redemption for her circus days, or a master strategist who knew exactly which levers to pull to stay in power? You watch her move through the palace, her silk robes whispering against the marble floors, a sound far different from the clanking armor you wore earlier. She carries herself with a poise that suggests she was born for the throne, despite the fact that most of the people bowing to her would have spat on her 5 years ago. The sensory world of Theodora's Constantinople is a riot of color and scent. You smell the sea air from the Bosphorus, mixed with the heavy, sweet aroma of cinnamon and cloves being unloaded from ships that have traveled the Silk Road. The palace is a labyrinth of gold leaf and shimmering mosaics, where the light bounces off the walls in a way that makes the very air feel expensive. You notice that Theodora doesn't just sit by the window and look pretty. She has her own court, her own spies, and her own agenda. She's a co-pilot of the empire, and Justinian treats her as an equal, a rarity in a world that generally viewed women as decorative additions to the household furniture. You think about the contrast between her childhood and her current reality. From the bear pits to the sacred palace, her life is a testament to the power of sheer, unadulterated willpower. It's the ultimate fake it till you make it story, except she isn't faking it anymore. She is the power. You see her presiding over meetings with foreign ambassadors, her eyes sharp and observant. She doesn't just listen to the words they say, she listens to the things they aren't saying. She's used to dealing with the bears of the circus. A few nervous diplomats from Persia are nothing she can't handle. The dark humor of her situation isn't lost on you. Here is a woman who was once a public spectacle, now ruling over the very people who used to pay a copper coin to watch her dance. It's a delicious kind of irony. She's turned her shame into a shield. You realize that in the high-stakes game of Byzantine politics, being an outsider is actually her greatest strength. She knows how the world works from the bottom up, giving her a perspective that Justinian, for all his brilliance, will never have. As the sun sets over the Golden Horn, casting a deep amber glow across the domes of the city, you see Theodora standing on a balcony, looking out over the empire. She now calls her own. The air is cooling, the city's noise softening into a low, distant hum. You feel the weight of her ambition, a quiet but relentless force that has reshaped the world. She's no longer the girl begging for a job in the dust. She is the empress, and she is just getting started. You take a slow breath, the scent of jasmine from the palace gardens filling your senses, and realize that the most dangerous weapon in Byzantium isn't a sword or a mace. It's the mind of a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The tranquility of the palace gardens is shattered by a sound that starts as a low vibration in your chest and grows into a deafening, unified roar. Nika! Nika! This isn't the cheering of fans at a sporting event. It's the sound of a city that has decided to burn itself down. It's January 532, and the Nika riots have turned Constantinople into a literal oven. The air is thick with the acrid stench of burning cedar and the gray, choking ash of the Hagia Sophia, which is currently collapsing in a heap of rubble. You are standing inside the palace walls, and for the first time, you see the invincible Emperor Justinian, looking like a man who has run out of ideas. He's pale, his hands are shaking, and he's currently supervising the loading of gold onto ships docked at the palace's private harbor. He's ready to run, to become just another exiled royal, living off his jewelry in some quiet corner of Italy. Justinian is surrounded by his advisors, all of them whispering about a strategic retreat and saving the dynasty. It's the medieval version of a board of directors trying to skip town before the auditors arrive. But then the room goes silent as Theodora stands up. She doesn't have a weapon and she isn't wearing armor, but she commands a space with the terrifying stillness of a predator. One mainstream historical fact that remains a centerpiece of her legacy is her speech during this crisis. She looked at her husband and told him that while flight might bring safety, it would also bring a lifetime of shame. She famously uttered the line, "Purple is the most noble shroud." In other words, she'd rather die as an empress in her royal robes than live as a runaway commoner. Her words are like a bucket of ice water to Justinian's panic. She basically tells him to man up, or at least to stay put while she handles the bears once again. This isn't just bravado, it's a calculated gamble. She knows that if they flee, the empire is gone. If they stay, there's a chance, a bloody, horrific chance, to reclaim control. A quirky fringe tidbit you might enjoy while you're tucked under your duvet is that Theodora's influence was so absolute in this moment that she reportedly stayed in the room while the generals Belisarius and Mundus planned the counterattack. In a world where women were supposed to stay in the gymnasium, the women's quarters, and worry about embroidery, she was essentially the acting chief of staff during a national security crisis. Historians still argue whether Theodora's Purple Shroud speech was actually a spontaneous outburst of courage or a carefully rehearsed piece of political theater designed to bolster Justinian's image for future chroniclers. Regardless of the intent, the result was a massacre. You watch from the palace battlements as the imperial troops are sent into the Hippodrome, the very place where Theodora grew up. They trapped 30,000 rioters inside and systematically canceled them with cold steel. It's a brutal, dark end to the rebellion, but when the sun rises the next day over a city of corpses and smoke, Justinian and Theodora are still wearing the purple. The aftermath of the Nika riots changes everything. Theodora is no longer just the actress wife. She is the co-ruler. She uses her newfound absolute power to enact laws that seem centuries ahead of their time. She passes legislation that gives women the right to own and inherit property, the 6th century version of financial independence. She outlaws forced prostitution and buys back young girls from brothels with her own money, setting up a house of repentance for them on the shores of the Bosphorus. It's a massive social welfare project funded by the woman who knew exactly what those girls were going through because she'd been there herself. The sensory world of post-riot Constantinople is one of reconstruction. You hear the constant clink-clink of stonemasons' hammers as the city is rebuilt on a scale that makes the old version look like a village. Theodora is heavily involved in the design of the new Hagia Sophia, ensuring that the church is a reflection of the divine power that kept her on the throne. The smell of fresh mortar and cut marble replaces the scent of ash. You see her walking through the construction sites, her silk robes picking up the white dust of the future. She's building a legacy that will outlast her skin and bones, a city of stone that serves as a monument to the girl from the bare pits who refused to run away. She also becomes a secret protector of the Miaphysites, a religious minority that her husband technically has to persecute to keep the peace with Rome. She hides their leaders in the palace, sometimes right under Justinian's nose. It's a dangerous game of theological hide-and-seek. You can imagine the dark humor of the situation. Justinian issuing an edict to arrest a certain monk while that very monk is currently having tea in Theodora's private chambers. She's the master of the double life, a skill she likely learned back in the circus. You think about the toll this power takes. Her health begins to fail. Likely cancer, though the doctors of the time call it all sorts of colorful, useless things. But she doesn't slow down. She remains the anchor of the empire, the one person Justinian can truly trust in a world of backstabbers and sycophants. When she finally passes away in 548, the light seems to go out of Justinian's reign. He never remarries. He spends the rest of his life as a lonely, tired man, surrounded by the ghosts of the woman who saved him from himself. As you drift towards sleep, you see the mosaic of Theodora in the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna. She's staring back at you with huge, unblinking eyes, holding a golden chalice, her head surrounded by a halo of gold and jewels. She looks like a goddess, distant and perfect. But you know the truth. You know about the bears, the mud of the arena, and the smell of the smoke over the hippodrome. You realize that purple isn't just a color. It's a scar earned through a lifetime of refusing to be what the world expected her to be. You take a final, deep breath of the cool night air, the image of the Empress fading into the soft velvet dark. And you realize that sometimes the most noble shroud is the one you weave for yourself. The shimmering gold mosaics of Byzantium fade into a horizon of heat-distorted sand, and the relentless, blinding glare of the Levantine sun. It is late in the 12th century, and the air no longer smells of incense and sea salt, but of parched dust, horse dung, and the metallic tang of blood-stained iron baking in the sun. You are now trudging alongside the forces of the Third Crusade. Your heavy woolen surcoat, once a vibrant white with a bold red cross, is now a dingy, sweat-stained gray, encrusted with the salt of your own exertion. You are following Richard the 14th of England, Richard the Lionheart, a man who is essentially a sentient weapon with a crown. Richard is the ultimate warrior king, a man who seems more comfortable in a saddle than on a throne, and he's currently obsessed with a city he has never seen, Jerusalem. Walking through this landscape is like trying to march through a fan-assisted oven. Every breath you take feels like it's drying out your lungs from the inside. You look at Richard, and even he, for all his legendary stamina, looks like he's being slowly simmered in his own armor. One mainstream historical fact that often gets overshadowed by the romantic tales of the Crusades is that Richard was a tactical genius, not just a brute. On the march toward Jaffa, he kept his army in a tight formation right along the coast, using the sea as a natural barrier to protect his flank while his fleet carried supplies. It was a 12th century version of a high-tech logistics chain, and it was the only reason you aren't currently a heap of sun-bleached bones in the desert. The Lionheart is a man of extremes. He's charismatic, terrifyingly brave, and has a temper that could set fire to a wet log. But he's also facing an opponent who is his equal in every way, Salah ad-Din or Saladin. As you march, you feel the constant, nagging presence of Saladin's horse archers. They don't engage in the chivalric charges you're used to back in Europe. Instead, they swarm like angry hornets, peppering your ranks with arrows and then vanishing back into the dunes before you can even draw your sword. It's a frustrating, asymmetric war that is driving you and your fellow crusaders to the brink of madness. You're playing a high-stakes game of tag where the person who is it has a composite bow and a very fast horse. A quirky fringe tidbit that might help you drift off is that Richard was so dedicated to the cause and so impatient that he reportedly helped clear the rubble at the siege of Acre with his own hands, hauling stones like a common laborer while suffering from a debilitating bout of Arnaldia. This was a mysterious medieval disease that caused your hair and fingernails to fall out. Imagine a king, bald and toothless, covered in stone dust and sweating through a fever, still shouting orders and swinging a pickaxe. It's a far cry from the polished, lion-maned portraits you see in history books. He wasn't a hero because he was perfect. He was a hero because he was too stubborn to die. Historians still argue whether Richard's decision to execute nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners at Acre was a calculated move to force Saladin's hand or a moment of pure, unadulterated war crime level frustration. It's a dark stain on the Lionheart legacy, a reminder that the age of chivalry was often just a fancy name for a very brutal reality. You remember the smell of that day, the salt air of the coast mixed with the copper scent of a massacre. It's a reminder that in this desert, mercy is a luxury that neither side can always afford. The sensory details of the campaign are a constant assault. You hear the rhythmic thud-thud of the drums from Saladin's camp, a psychological weapon designed to keep you from sleeping. You smell the pungent aroma of Greek fire, that terrifying incendiary weapon that could burn even on water. Smelling like sulfur and naphtha, your skin is a map of sunburns and insect bites, and you've developed a deep personal hatred for the sand that manages to get inside your boots, your armor, and even your bread. It's like living inside a piece of sandpaper. Richard himself is a fascinating study in contradictions. He's a poet and a musician, yet he's most at home in the middle of a slaughter. He speaks several languages but has little patience for diplomacy. He's the medieval version of a rock star on a world tour that has gone horribly wrong. Yet he keeps playing the hits because he doesn't know what else to do. You see him looking toward the horizon, toward Jerusalem, with a look of such intense longing that it's almost painful to watch. He's a man who has wagered his entire kingdom on a single city, and the desert is slowly clawing it back. The dark humor of your situation isn't lost on you. Here you are, thousands of miles from the green fields of England or France, fighting for a piece of land that seems to want you dead just as much as the enemy does. You're wearing layers of wool and steel in 100-degree heat because some priest told you it would save your soul. It's a bit like joining a gym that only has one treadmill and it's located in the middle of a volcano. You laugh a dry, rasping laugh that sounds like two pieces of flint rubbing together. As the sun begins to set, casting long, violet shadows over the dunes, the temperature finally drops, but the tension does not. You know that Saladin is out there, watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. You settle down for the night, the sand still warm beneath your bedroll. You look up at the stars, which seem brighter and closer than they ever did back home. They are the same stars that Saladin is looking at. You realize that you are caught between two titans, two men who have turned this desert into a stage for their own personal drama. You take a final, deep breath of the cooling air, the scent of parched earth and distant campfires, filling your nose, and you wonder if any of you will ever actually see the gates of the city you've traveled so far to find. You shift your weight in the cooling sand, looking across the no man's land toward the flickering campfires of the Ayyubid army. While your own king, Richard, is a storm of iron and temper, the man leading the forces across the dunes is something else entirely. You've heard the stories whispered around the Crusader watchfires. Stories of a leader who treats his prisoners with more grace than your own lords treat their peasants. This is Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to you as Saladin. He is the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, and in the eyes of your fellow knights, he has become the ultimate noble pagan. It's a strange, paradoxical respect. You've come here to reclaim the Holy Land from him, yet you find yourself admiring the way he carries himself. If Richard is the lion, Saladin is the deep water, quiet, vast, and impossible to truly pin down. One mainstream historical fact that defines Saladin's reputation is his conquest of Jerusalem in 1187, unlike the first crusade, which saw the streets of the city run red with blood. Saladin's entry was remarkably bloodless. He allowed the Christian inhabitants to buy their freedom and even used his own personal treasury to pay the ransoms of the poor who couldn't afford to leave. It was the medieval equivalent of a corporate takeover where the new CEO pays out the pensions of the employees he's laying off. For a soldier like you, raised on tales of holy slaughter, this level of restraint is almost harder to understand than a direct charge. It challenges your entire worldview. You were told you were fighting monsters, but you're starting to suspect you're fighting a man who might be more chivalrous than the Pope himself. The atmosphere of the Saracen camp, as seen from a distance, feels more organized, more intellectual than your own. While your camp smells of wet dogs and unwashed wool, theirs seems to carry the scent of rosewater, coffee, and old parchment. A quirky fringe tidbit that adds to the legend of Saladin is his obsession with education and justice. He was known to spend his few hours of leisure listening to poetry or discussing philosophy with scholars, even in the middle of a campaign. He once famously said that kings are only the shadows of God upon earth, which is a pretty heavy thought to have while you're also trying to manage a multinational army of horse archers. He wasn't just a general, he was a scholar king who happened to be very, very good at reclaiming territory. Historians still argue whether Saladin's legendary magnanimity was a genuine reflection of his deeply held Islamic values or a masterful exercise in psychological warfare designed to make the Crusaders look like the barbarians in comparison. Was he a saint in a turban, or was he the world's first truly great PR agent? To you, standing guard in the dark, the distinction doesn't much matter. You've seen his messengers arrive at your camp, men who speak perfect French or Latin, carrying terms that are firm but oddly respectful. It makes a war feel less like a clash of civilizations and more like a very high-stakes chess match between two grandmasters who actually quite like each other's style. The sensory details of Saladin's presence are felt in the way his army moves. They don't clank, they hum. The sound of their composite bows, made of layers of wood, bone, and sinew, is a sharp twang followed by a whistle that haunts your dreams. You've seen the arrows they use. They are light, fast, and remarkably accurate. It's the 12th century version of precision-guided munitions. And then there are the horses. While your destriers are heavy, lumbering beasts built for impact, the Arabian horses of Saladin's cavalry are like desert wind given form. They are smaller, leaner, and possess a level of endurance that makes your own mounts look like they're moving in slow motion. It's like trying to catch a hummingbird with a butterfly net while you're wearing a suit of lead. The dark humor of your situation is starting to set in. You've spent your life savings to travel halfway across the world to fight a villain who, by all accounts, is a better host than your local bishop. You hear a story about a crusader knight who lost his horse in battle, and Saladin, seeing the man fighting on foot, sent him 2 fresh mounts because a king should not have to fight on the ground. You imagine your own local lord doing that. He wouldn't even give you a fresh pair of socks if yours were full of holes. You start to realize that the code of chivalry isn't a European invention, it's a universal language that both sides are speaking, even if they're using different alphabets. As you look out at the desert, the moonlight turns the sand into a sea of silver. You think about the concept of jihad, which your priests have told you means holy war, but which Saladin scholars describe as a struggle, both an outward one for the land and an inward one for the soul. You feel the weight of your own struggle in the ache of your joints and the dryness of your throat. You realize that Saladin isn't just defending a city, he's defending a way of life that feels more ancient and settled than anything you've left behind in the damp forests of the north. The respect between Richard and Saladin is becoming the talk of the camp. They've never actually met face to face, a fact that seems impossible given how much they influence each other's lives. But they exchange gifts and letters like old pen pals. It's the most polite war in history. You imagine them sitting down for a meal together, discussing the merits of a heavy lance versus a scimitar, while their armies wait outside to kill each other. It's a surreal, almost absurd thought. You take a sip of your lukewarm water, which tastes faintly of the leather skin it's kept in, and wonder what Saladin is thinking right now. Is he looking at your campfires, seeing the same flicker of humanity that you see in his? The night air is still, and for a moment, the sounds of the horses and the distant drums fade away. You feel a strange sense of peace, a quiet recognition that you're part of something much larger than a mere territorial dispute. You are witnessing the meeting of 2 worlds, and even though you are here as a conqueror, you are being conquered by the grace of your enemy. You lean against your spear, the wood cool against your gloved hand, and let the rhythmic, soft breathing of the camp act as a lullaby. Tomorrow the sun will rise, the heat will return, and the chess match will continue. But for tonight, the desert belongs to the stars and to the quiet, noble shadow of the Sultan. The dust of the day's skirmish has settled, and you find yourself resting near the king's pavilion, listening to a story that sounds like something out of a courtly romance. Yet it's happening right here in the middle of a war zone. It's the late summer of 1192, and Richard the Lionheart has fallen ill. The Arnaldia has returned, or perhaps it's the scurvy of the desert, leaving the most feared warrior in Christendom shivering under a pile of furs. His fever making the very air seem to vibrate. Back home, if a king fell ill during a siege, his enemies would be sharpening their blades and preparing the funeral pyre. But here, the rules are different. You watch as a small caravan flies a flag of truce, approaching from Saladin's lines. They aren't carrying a demand for surrender. They're carrying baskets of snow from the peaks of Mount Hermon and fresh pears and peaches. One mainstream historical fact that historians love to cite as the pinnacle of medieval chivalry is this exact exchange. Saladin, hearing that his brother, King Richard, was burning with fever, sent his own personal physicians and the cooling luxury of mountain ice to help break the malady. Think about that for a second. In an era where medicine usually involved balancing your humors with a leeches and prayer combo, Saladin sent the 12th century version of a 5-star medical team and a literal bucket of ice cream ingredients to the man trying to take his city. It's the ultimate get well soon card from the person who is also trying to kill you. It's as if two rival tech CEOs were in a legal battle for the ages, but one sent a private jet and a team of specialists when the other got a migraine. As you watch the Saracen doctors move through the camp, you notice the suspicious glares of your fellow crusaders. To them, this is high-level sorcery or a clever assassination plot. You, however, are starting to see the dark humor in it all. You're currently eating a piece of salt pork that's older than your squire, while the king is snacking on chilled fruit provided by the enemy. A quirky fringe tidbit you might find amusing is that Richard, in his fever-induced delirium, reportedly proposed a marriage between his sister, Joan of England, and Saladin's brother, Al-Adil. The idea was that the two of them would rule Jerusalem together as a unity ticket, ending the war with a wedding instead of a massacre. Historians still chuckle at the thought of the Pope's reaction to that particular press release. It was a diplomatic Hail Mary that never stood a chance, but it shows just how much these two sides had come to respect, and even like, one another. Historians still argue whether these acts of kindness were genuine personal gestures between two alpha males who recognized each other's greatness, or if they were cold, calculated moves in a long-game diplomatic strategy. By sending ice and fruit, Saladin wasn't just being nice, he was asserting his dominance. He was saying, I have so much control over this land that I can send you the mountains and the orchards while you sit in the dirt. It's the ultimate flex. You look at the ice melting in a silver bowl and realize that in the desert, water is more powerful than gold, and the man who controls the ice is the man who truly rules. The sensory details of this polite war are surreal. You can smell the sweetness of the peaches cutting through the oppressive, metallic scent of the camp. The ice creates a tiny microclimate of coolness in the king's tent, a ghost of a breeze that feels like a miracle in the 100-degree heat. You hear the soft, melodic Arabic of the physicians as they consult with Richard's frantic Norman doctors. It's a collision of cultures happening over a sickbed. You realize that while the soldiers on both sides are still dying in the trenches, the leaders are engaged in a sophisticated dance of etiquette. It's like a very violent episode of a period drama where everyone is incredibly polite right before they stab each other in the heart. You think back to the crocodile dung sunscreen stories you heard about the ancient Egyptians, and you realize that Saladin's doctors are centuries ahead of anything you've seen in Europe. They talk about hygiene and diet as if they are actual scientific concepts rather than suggestions from a local hermit. It makes you wonder if the infidels you were sent to enlighten are actually the ones holding the candles. You feel a strange sense of cognitive dissonance. You came here to bring civilization, but you're the one currently covered in lice and eating hardtack, while your enemy is discussing the medicinal properties of citrus. The dark irony reaches its peak during the Battle of Jaffa. Richard, recovered from his fever but still weakened, finds himself fighting on the beach. His horse is killed under him. Remember that moment from the last section. And Saladin, watching from the hills, is genuinely distressed to see a king fighting on foot like a commoner. He immediately sends a groom with two magnificent Arabian stallions, with a message stating that a warrior of Richard's stature should not be disgraced by having to walk. It's the medieval version of calling an Uber for your opponent because their car broke down on the way to the fight. You see Richard mount one of the horses and ride it back into the fray to kill more of Saladin's men. It's a cycle of violence and virtue that makes your head spin. As the sun sets, casting long golden syrup shadows over the surf, you realize that the Third Crusade has become less about territory and more about a mutual obsession. Richard and Saladin are trapped in a feedback loop of chivalry. They are the only two people on Earth who truly understand the pressure the other is under. You take a slow breath, the evening air finally losing its bite, and you feel the weight of the history being made. This isn't just a war, it's a legend being written in real time, flavored with the taste of peaches and the cold sting of mountain snow. You settle into your bedroll, the rhythmic sound of the waves providing a steady, oceanic lullaby. You think about home, about the cold, damp forest of England, and how alien they seem now. You've been changed by this desert, and by the strange, beautiful grace of your enemy. You realize that sometimes the most important battles aren't won with a sword, but with a piece of fruit and a bit of respect. You let your eyes close, the image of the melting ice lingering in your mind, and you drift into a dream where the lions and the sultans are finally at peace, if only for the duration of a fever. The peaches are gone, the ice has long since melted into the thirsty earth, and a heavy, collective sigh seems to hang over the entire Levantine coast. It is September 1192, and the air is thick with the scent of sea salt and the weary, dusty smell of an ending. You are standing on the ramparts of Jaffa, looking out at a horizon that has seen too much blood and too little progress. The grand drama of the Third Crusade is finally winding down, not with a climactic, world-shattering battle, but with the scratching of quills on parchment. You feel it in your bones, the mutual exhaustion that has settled over both armies like a thick woolen blanket. Richard the Lionheart is broke. His kingdom in England is being nibbled away by his brother John, and he's still hacking up a lung from his various desert ailments. Saladin, meanwhile, is facing a growing restlessness among his emirs and a treasury that is looking as dry as a sun-bleached bone. This is the moment of the Treaty of Jaffa. One mainstream historical fact that often surprises people who expect a clear winner is that this treaty was a masterpiece of compromise. Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, the very thing you came here to prevent, but the coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa would stay in Christian hands. Most importantly, Saladin agreed to allow unarmed Christian pilgrims and merchants free access to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It was a 12th century version of a shared custody agreement for a holy site. No one got exactly what they wanted, which is usually the sign of a very good, or at least a very necessary, diplomatic deal. You aren't going home with the keys to the city, but you are going home with your life, which is a trade-off you are increasingly happy to make. As you watch the messengers ride back and forth, you notice the atmosphere has shifted from hostility to a strange, weary camaraderie. A quirky fringe tidbit you might enjoy while you're settling into your pillow is that during the final negotiations, Richard was so done with the whole affair that he reportedly told Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, that he'd be happy to leave the entire mess in his hands if he could just get a boat home. There are even accounts of Crusaders and Saracens going on joint hunting trips in the final days of the truce, chasing gazelles together across the very fields where they had been trying to disembowel each other only weeks before. It's like two rival sports teams going out for drinks after a season-ending game that ended in a scoreless tie. The Lion and the Sultan had fought each other to a standstill, and in that stillness, they found a mutual respect that surpassed their religious differences. Historians still argue whether Richard ever truly intended to honor the treaty, or if he viewed it simply as a strategic pause to go home, fix his domestic problems, and return with a fresh army. He famously looked back at the receding shoreline of Palestine and whispered a prayer that God would grant him enough life to return and finish the job. He never did. He died a few years later from a crossbow bolt wound in France, a mercy dagger of a different sort. To you, however, the why doesn't matter as much as the what. The what is that the gates of Jerusalem are finally open, even if you have to leave your sword at the door. The sensory details of the departure are bittersweet. You hear the rhythmic, mournful creaking of the wooden ships as they are loaded in the harbor, a sound that matches the slow thumping of your heart. The smell of the desert, that dry, spicy heat, is being replaced by the sharp, ozone tang of the Mediterranean. You see the first group of pilgrims heading towards the inland hills, their heads bowed, carrying nothing but their staves and their faith. They are walking into the territory of the enemy, protected by nothing but the word of a man they were told was a monster. You realize that Saladin's shroud of purple is his honor. He has staked his reputation on the safety of these people, and in the East, reputation is the only currency that never devalues. The dark humor of the situation is that you're leaving with a tan, a few scars, and a very expensive set of memories, but without the grand prize. You think about all the gold, all the lives, and all the sermons that went into this campaign. It's like spending 3 years training for a marathon only to be told at the finish line that the medals were back ordered, but you're welcome to a free glass of water. You laugh a quiet, tired laugh. You've seen the world, you've tasted mountain ice in a fever dream, and you've learned that the man across the field isn't an infidel. He's just a man who loves his city as much as you love yours. As your ship finally pulls away from the docks, the white walls of Jaffa begin to shrink. You see the banners of the Ayyubids fluttering on the towers, and next to them, for the first time in years, the peaceful flow of civilian traffic. The war hasn't ended with a bang, but with a quiet, dusty peace. You realize that Richard and Saladin have created something rare, a moment of balance in a world of extremes. They were both too strong to be defeated and too wise to keep trying. You find a spot on the deck, leaning against a coil of rope that smells of tar and hemp. The motion of the ship is a steady, rocking lullaby, a welcome change from the jarring gait of a warhorse. You watch the sun dip below the horizon, turning the sea into a sheet of hammered copper. You think about Saladin, back in his palace, probably reading poetry or planning a new hospital, and you think about Richard, already pacing the deck of his own ship, dreaming of his next conquest. You are the extra in their epic movie, finally heading home to a world that will never quite understand what you've seen. You close your eyes, the sound of the waves washing away the last of the desert. Grit, and you drift into a deep, dreamless sleep, knowing that for now, at least, the lions and the sultans have laid down their arms. The salty spray of the Mediterranean and the noble weariness of the Crusades evaporate into the heavy, suffocating air of first-century Rome. You aren't on a ship anymore. You're reclining on a plush, silk-covered couch in the Domus Aurea, Nero's golden house. The smell of the desert has been replaced by a dizzying, almost nauseating olfactory assault. Heavy musk, exotic spices, and the scent of thousands of crushed rose petals that are currently drifting down from the ceiling like a floral blizzard. You're a guest at one of Emperor Nero's legendary banquets, and while the surroundings are the height of luxury, you feel a cold prickle of sweat at the base of your neck. This isn't just a dinner party, it's a high-stakes performance where the audience is also the menu. You look up and the ceiling actually moves. This is the Coenatio Rotunda, a masterpiece of Roman engineering that is literally a rotating dining room designed to mimic the movement of the celestial bodies. Think of it as the world's most expensive and dizzying revolving restaurant, powered not by electricity, but by a hidden team of sweating slaves turning massive wooden gears in the basement. As the room slowly turns, the ivory panels in the ceiling slide open to shower you with perfume and flowers. One mainstream historical fact you should know is that Nero's Golden House was an architectural scandal. It was built on land cleared by the Great Fire of Rome, leading to the rumor that he started the blaze just to make room for his new dining room. It's the ultimate gentrification project fueled by ash and ego. Nero himself is seated at the head of the table, and he looks less like a god and more like a man who has spent too much time believing his own press releases. He's wearing a shimmering Greek robe and has a crown of laurel leaves perched on his carefully curled hair. He's currently explaining the subtle metaphors in the poem he just recited, and you, along with every other senator in the room, are nodding with a fervor that borders on religious mania. You realize that your life depends on your ability to look fascinated. If you yawn, you might find yourself facing a retirement plan that involves a hungry lion or a very sharp blade. A quirky fringe tidbit for your sleepy mind. Nero was so obsessed with his own artistic genius that he reportedly had the doors to his performances locked so no one could leave. People would actually feign death or jump from the windows just to escape his 5-hour lyre solos. Tonight, however, the exit is blocked by guards, and the only way out is through the dessert course. Historians still argue whether Nero's banquets were truly the scenes of depraved, mindless excess described by later Roman writers like Suetonius, or if these accounts were politically motivated hit pieces designed to justify the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Was he a monstrous antichrist of gluttony, or just an eccentric, poorly advised young man with a very large credit limit? From your perspective, as you watch a servant pour wine from a flagon shaped like a dolphin, the distinction feels irrelevant. The excess is real, and the fear in the room is thick enough to spread on a piece of unleavened bread. The sensory overload of the feast is designed to bypass your reason and hit your lizard brain. You are presented with dishes that seem more like art projects than food. There are whole peacocks served with their feathers reattached, looking like they might fly off the table, and bowls of flamingo tongues stewed in a sauce made from fermented fish guts and rare spices. It's the first century version of molecular gastronomy, where the goal isn't to taste good, but to shock the senses and display the emperor's reach. You're eating the entire map of the known world, from the spices of the east to the game of the northern forest. It's a meal that screams, I own everything you see and I can eat it if I want to. The dark humor of the situation is that you're surrounded by the finest things on earth, yet you've never been less hungry. You look at the senator next to you. He's sweating through his toga, his eyes darting toward the emperor every time he takes a sip of wine. This is the golden cage of Nero's Rome. You are being fed the best food in the world while living in a state of psychological terror. It's like being invited to a billionaire's private island, but the billionaire keeps hinting that he might hunt you for sport after the appetizers. You take a bite of a honey-glazed dormouse, trying not to think about what it actually is, and force a smile that feels like it's been painted on your face. The room continues its slow, hypnotic rotation. Through the massive windows, you can see the lights of Rome flickering in the distance. The city is still rebuilding, a patchwork of charred ruins and gleaming new marble. You think about the crocodile dung, sunscreen, or the purple shrouds of the people we've met earlier, and you realize that every era has its own brand of madness. Nero's madness is just more expensive. He's turned the world into a theater, and he's the only one allowed to write the script. You hear him laugh, a high, thin sound that cuts through the music of the flutes, and you feel a chill that has nothing to do with the night air. The air in the room is getting heavier, thick with the scent of the oils burning in the silver lamps. The music is a constant, low-frequency hum that seems to vibrate in your very bones. You find yourself drifting into a sort of trance. The colors of the wall paintings, vivid reds and deep blues, blurring into a single, shimmering haze. You realize that this is exactly what Nero wants. He wants you disoriented, overwhelmed, and completely dependent on his whim. He is the sun around which this entire gilded world revolves, and you are just a tiny shivering planet trying not to get pulled into the fire. As the night wears on, the conversation becomes more erratic, the laughter more forced. Nero begins to talk about his plans for a new city, Neronia, that will rise from the ruins of old Rome. He speaks with a visionary's intensity, his eyes wide and unblinking. You realize that he isn't just an emperor, he's a man who has completely lost the thread of reality, and he's taking the entire empire with him. You take a slow, deep breath, trying to ground yourself in the physical reality of the couch beneath you. You are a witness to the peak of Roman decadence, a moment of beautiful, terrifying instability. The rotation of the room finally slows as the first hints of dawn begin to touch the sky. The banquet is drawing to a close, not because the guests are tired, but because the emperor has decided the performance is over. You stand up, your limbs feeling heavy and strange, and prepare to leave the golden house. You walk through the vast, empty halls, your footsteps echoing on the marble, and you feel a strange sense of relief. You've survived another night in Nero's world. You step out into the cool morning air, the scent of the rose petals still clinging to your hair, and realize that while the golden house may be a marvel of the world, you'd much rather be sleeping in a tent in the desert or a drafty castle in the north. Anywhere, as long as the ceiling stays still and no one is asking you to critique their poetry. You are back on that silk-lined couch, but the rose petals are no longer a novelty. They are a physical burden. It is 3 o'clock in the morning, and the edible experiment of Nero's kitchen has moved into its most surreal phase. A servant approaches with a platter that looks like a miniature battlefield. In the center, a whole roasted peacock sits in a nest of its own iridescent tail feathers, its beak gilded with real gold. Surrounding it are small bowls filled with what you are told are the tongues of nightingales and flamingos, simmered in a reduction of rosewater and honey. You take a bite, and it tastes like floral perfume mixed with a texture you'd rather not describe. It's a meal designed to shock the senses, a display of power that says the emperor can command the very voices of the birds to be silenced for your mid-dinner snack. The sensory overload of this gastronomic theater is the point. One mainstream historical fact you might find hard to swallow is that Roman elite dining wasn't just about nutrition, it was about conspicuous consumption. Nero wasn't just feeding you, he was demonstrating that he had the logistics to bring fresh seafood from the coast and exotic birds from Africa to your plate in the middle of a hot Roman night. It's the first century version of ordering high-end sushi via private jet just because you can. The menu was a map of his dominion. If he could serve you a dish that required the deaths of 1,000 songbirds, it was a subtle reminder that he could just as easily sign a warrant for the deaths of 1,000 senators. As you look around the room, you see the vomitorium myth being dispelled in real time. Contrary to popular belief, and this is a quirky fringe tidbit for your sleepy brain, the vomitorium wasn't a room where Romans went to purge so they could eat more. It was actually the architectural term for the wide exit tunnels in theaters and stadiums that allowed the crowds to spew out quickly after a show. However, the reality of Nero's banquets was often just as messy. Guests would eat until they were physically ill, not because of a specific room, but because the social pressure to keep consuming was relentless. To stop eating was to insult the emperor's hospitality, and insulting Nero was a very efficient way to ensure you never had to worry about your cholesterol levels again. Historians still argue whether the more bizarre items on the menu, like the sow's udders stuffed with sea urchins, were actually common delicacies or if they were the inventions of later satirists trying to make the Julio-Claudians look as grotesque as possible. In this room, however, the smells are too real to be a literary invention. You can smell the garum, that pungent, fermented fish sauce that Romans put on everything from meat to dessert. It's a sharp, salty, slightly rotten aroma that cuts through the heavy sweetness of the incense. It's the smell of an empire that is literally fermenting in its own success. The dark humor of the evening is finding itself in the party favors. Nero has a habit of giving out gifts that are actually thinly veiled threats. You might receive a beautiful gold ring, or you might receive a gift of a pre-written confession for a conspiracy you haven't even joined yet. You watch a fellow guest receive a jar of rare pearls, and the look on his face isn't joy. It's the look of a man who just realized he's being paid off before being sent into exile. It's like being at a corporate retreat where the Employee of the Month award is actually a pink slip wrapped in tinfoil. You keep your head down and focus on your flamingo tongue, trying to look like you're having the time of your life. The room's rotation has a way of making the entire experience feel like a fever dream. The frescoes on the walls, depicting scenes of gods and monsters, seem to dance in the flickering light of the oil lamps. You feel a strange sense of vertigo, not just from the movement of the floor, but from the moral vacuum of the palace. You think back to the knights in the mud or the empress in the bear pits. Their lives were brutal, yes, but they were grounded in something tangible: survival, power, legacy. Nero's world is grounded in nothing but his own whim. It's a hall of mirrors where the only thing that's real is the emperor's boredom. You hear the sound of the lyre again. Nero is tuning his instrument, a sound like a cat being dragged across a harp. The room goes deathly silent. This is the moment everyone fears. He begins to sing a long, rambling epic about the fall of Troy. And you have to sit there, a half-eaten peacock in front of you, and pretend that you are listening to the voice of Apollo himself. You notice that the palace guards are positioned at every exit. You realize that you are an audience member in a performance that has no scheduled end time. It's an ultimate captive audience. The smell of the lamps is starting to give you a headache. It's a mix of cheap olive oil and expensive perfume, a cloying, heavy scent that settles in the back of your throat. You look at the wine in your cup, a deep, dark Falernian that has been aged for decades. It's beautiful, but you wonder if it's been spiked with something to keep you in this state of compliant lethargy. You take a tiny sip, the liquid feeling like velvet and fire. You realize that Nero isn't just an emperor, he's a director, and you are just an extra in a movie that has a very high body count. As the song drags into its second hour, you find yourself staring at a mosaic on the floor. It depicts a skeleton holding a wine jug, a common Roman motif known as a memento mori. Remember, you must die. In this room, surrounded by gold and peacocks, the message feels less like a philosophical reminder and more like a tactical update. You realize that the Golden House is just a very beautiful, very expensive waiting room for the inevitable. You take a deep breath, the scent of the rose petals now smelling faintly of decay, and prepare yourself for the next course, the next song, and the next day in the life of a man who is currently the favorite of the most dangerous host in history. The silver lamps are flickering now, their oil running low. casting long, jerky shadows that dance across the ivory-paneled walls like ghosts. The rotating ceiling has finally come to a halt, but the world still feels as though it is spinning. You are trapped in the final, most dangerous hour of Nero's hospitality, the transition from the feast to the reckoning. The music has stopped, and the only sound is the heavy, rhythmic breathing of 100 terrified aristocrats and the occasional clink of a spoon against a ceramic bowl. You look at Nero, and the playful artistic persona has vanished. He is slumped in his chair, his eyes dark and scanning the room with a predatory intensity. This is the hangover of absolute power. The emperor is no longer looking for applause. He is looking for a reason to be angry. One mainstream historical fact that characterizes the end of Nero's reign is the Pisonian conspiracy of 65 AD. It was a plot to assassinate him, involving some of his closest advisors, including the philosopher Seneca. Because of this, every banquet in these final years is a minefield of paranoia. Every smile you offer must be perfectly calibrated. Too wide, and you look like you're mocking him. Too thin, and you look like you're plotting his demise. It is a form of psychological gymnastics that is more exhausting than any cavalry charge or bear pit performance. You are performing the joy of the loyal subject, with the desperation of a man walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. The sensory details have shifted from the extravagant to the visceral. The air is no longer sweet with roses, it is thick with the smell of stale wine, burnt oil, and the cold, metallic scent of fear. You can hear the heavy tread of the Praetorian Guard in the hallway, the rhythmic clomp-clomp of their iron-shod boots on the marble floors. It's a sound that cuts through the silence like a heartbeat. A quirky fringe tidbit that might help you drift off is that Nero reportedly kept a list of the doomed near his bed, and he would often cross-reference it during his banquets. If he caught you looking too comfortable or too bored, your name might just find its way onto the parchment before the sun came up. It's the ultimate naughty or nice list, but the only gift you get for being naughty is a forced suicide. Historians still argue whether Nero actually played his lyre while Rome burned, or if that was a myth created to illustrate his utter detachment from the suffering of his people. Standing here in the golden house, watching him pick at a piece of fruit with a gold-handled knife, you realize the truth doesn't really matter. The vibe is what's real. He is a man who has replaced reality with a stage play, and you are just the unlucky extras who have to stay in character until the curtain falls. You see a senator across the table accidentally drop his wine cup. The sound is like a thunderclap in the silence. The man turns the color of a fresh linen toga, his eyes wide and pleading. Nero just stares at him for a long, agonizing minute before letting out a soft, dry chuckle. The tension breaks, but only slightly. The dark humor of your survival is that you've become a master of the emperor's smile. You've learned how to laugh at jokes that aren't funny and how to look moved by poetry that sounds like a donkey having a seizure. You realize that this is the true cost of the Roman Empire. Not the wars, not the taxes, but the slow, steady erosion of your own soul as you pretend to love a monster. You think back to the knights we discussed at the start of tonight's journey. Their armor was heavy, but it was honest. Here, your armor is your face, and if it cracks even for a second, the consequences are far more permanent than a dent in a breastplate. The light of dawn is finally beginning to bleed through the high windows of the Domus Aurea, turning the gold leaf on the walls a cold, pale yellow. The party is over. Nero stands up, stretching his arms as if he's just finished a particularly difficult day at the office. He gives a vague, dismissive wave of his hand, and the guards move to open the doors. You stand up, your legs shaking from hours of forced reclining, and you walk toward the exit. You don't look back. You don't look at the other guests. You just focus on the sensation of the cool morning air on your face as you step out of the golden house and back into the real world. The city is waking up. You can hear the distant rumble of carts and the calls of the street vendors. It's a normal day for everyone else, but for you, it's a miracle. You've survived another night in the presence of a god who thinks he's an artist. You walk toward your home. The smell of the palace, the musk, the fish sauce, the rotting roses, slowly fading in the crisp morning breeze. You realize that you've traveled a long way tonight, from the muddy fields of France to the bare pits of Byzantium, across the burning deserts of the Crusades, and finally into the gilded nightmare of Nero's Rome. As you reach your own bed, you feel a profound sense of gratitude for the silence. No clashing swords, no roaring crowds, no Nika chants, and no lyre solos. Just the quiet, steady rhythm of your own breathing. You've seen the truth about knights, the rise of an empress, the respect between enemies, and the madness of an emperor. You've worn the armor, the silk, and the purple shroud, and now, finally, you can take it all off. The journey is over now, and the world of history is beginning to dissolve into the soft, quiet edges of your room. Let the weight of the steel and the glint of the gold fade away, replaced by the warmth of your blankets and the gentle rhythm of the night. The heavy clanking of lances and the frantic roar of the hippodrome are nothing more than distant echoes sinking deeper and deeper into the earth. You are safe, you are still, and the past is exactly where it belongs, locked away in the pages of time. Feel your shoulders soften as the tension of the emperor's smile leave your face. There are no more gaps to find, no more treaties to sign, and no more banquets to survive. The air around you is cool and steady, carrying only the scent of home and the promise of rest. The lions have gone back to their dens. The sultans have closed their tents, and even the golden house has finally gone dark. You are drifting now, floating on a sea of quiet moments, moving further away from the noise of the centuries. The stars you saw over the desert are the same stars watching over you now, silent and eternal. They don't care about crowns or crusades. They only know the beauty of the dark. Let your mind follow their lead, wandering into the velvet space where stories end and dreams begin. Everything is settled. Everything is at peace. The weight of the world has lifted, leaving you light, calm, and ready to let go. Sleep is a soft shroud of its own, a noble purple that wraps around you and carries you into the stillness.